How many people do you have to apologize to every week for scaring when they were young with War of the Worlds?
Well, Graham, that's a good question, because when I first saw the War of the Worlds released, and it took off, not just here in the UK, but around the world, is probably the question that you've just asked that started right from the get-go. And I was sort of very happy, in a way, to hear it was having such a reaction, because so many people just usually, to start with anyway, young guys who were maybe in their teens or above, but would turn off all the lights in their house and even climb under their bed deliberately to get scared by it. and I was baffled, because I was thinking, well, I've just composed and produced a musical work based upon a brilliant and first science fiction story ever written, but it's appearing on a piece of plastic. So no matter how good the recording may have been, I still couldn't get my head around the fact that it's a record. It's not like a TV or a radio report that's talking about something that's actually happening. Uh-huh. But over a period of time, I've sort of gotten used to the fact that it's had that impact, and I'm very, very proud of that in a way, because I had no idea it was going to really resonate like that.
So what did you think it would do?
Well, what I hoped it would do was entertain people from a musical point of view. The story is what I fell in love with. I felt was incredible, and it's lasted, here I am now talking to you 40 years after my double album was first released. So I just wanted to entertain people, satisfy myself as a composer, arranger, and a producer, without question, because it had been the first time in my career that I had the chance to just start with a blank page, so to speak, and whatever came out of me came out. So I guess it had a few different things that it achieved when I finally completed it, saw it come out, and become popular.
And what was the inspiration for you? Because there's been a couple of movies made of it. There's obviously the H.G. Wells book. Where did it start for you?
It began with my father, in fact, who about a year before I read The War of the Worlds, he kept reminding me that within my own aspirations as a composer, a producer, was to find a story or two in my career that I just felt very passionate about, and would create something along the lines of a musical work as The War of the Worlds came out. And I agreed with him, because I was doing a lot of producing, arranging, commissions from TV, commercials, movies, but I hadn't really been composing big projects that I was starting out from my own starting point. And it was something I wanted to do, so we agreed to just start reading books, not even science fiction per se. And it took about a year to find The War of the Worlds, and the way it actually happened was that during that period I was producing, arranging, and then going out on tour with David Essex, who was really popular, and we were enjoying a great run together. And I would MD his bands, play keyboards on stage within the band, and do all the arrangements. And it was during that period a tour came up, and my dad came over to wish me well for it, literally the night before I was going out on the road with David, and then handed me yet another book. And that book was H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which I really didn't know very much about.
Yeah.
But after a year of sort of reading all sorts of books, this one just grabbed me, and I read it while we were on the road. There was no computers, no internet in those days, but this one as a book comforted me while I was on the road, and it just grabbed me from the very start on one read, and that was the beginning of it. So that was sort of around 1975.
So let's go back to the beginning then. You grew up in the United States, where?
I was born in New York, mm-hmm. and as a little boy, my parents and myself, we moved to England because my dad was a singer and an actor, and he secured the lead in a Broadway musical that was now coming to London called Guys and Dolls, and he played the original romantic gambler of Sky Masterson, and that's was the first occasion that I came to England, and it turned out we stayed for about 4 years because my dad kept getting all sorts of other work from recordings, other stage productions, a couple of films, TV work, and then we returned to New York again for about 4 years.
So what age were you at this stage, Jeff?
I was about 8, something like that. After going back to New York, and I started high school there, we then moved to California for about 6 years because my dad started getting film, TV work. He kept his recordings going. And then he decided he wanted to start writing and producing more and came back to England to produce, as he did, a few different shows. One of them turned out to be a musical for the West End that ran at the Palace Theatre where Harry Potter's running now, and many other shows before it. And I had no real major CV at that time. My musical career in California was just at an embryonic stage. But my dad and I had actually written a few songs together, and he believed that I was the right composer to come over or come back to England and compose the score. I think the truth of it was pure nepotism. You know, a producer producing a major West End show, you know, would have the pick of almost all the top composers who had experience in writing musicals. But he stuck by me. I kept saying to him, "Are you sure? You know, I could totally understand if you want to go for anybody else." And he said, "Nope, I think this is going to work." And
what age were you by now?
About by the time he came back, I was about 16, 17,
wow,
something like that.
That's quite a break.
Well, it was. I mean, it was about another year or two before I finally came back to England because he was still setting up the production and all the things that you do, you know, to really get anything going. And I spent 6 years in California going through high school and college, and my degree in college was in fact not in music, but it was in journalism, because that's where I was heading, and music was going to be what I did for fun. But I got halfway through with an AA. I got an AA degree, which is a 2-year course, and instead of staying on for another 2 years and converting it into a master's degree, I switched over to music because that was the point that I realized that music was the direction I wanted to go professionally. And so I didn't get the degree because it was about a year and a half after starting with a music course. My dad confirmed, come back to England, let's get going for Two Cities, as it was called. It was based on Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities.
And what were the major differences you found moving to England as a young man? What did you have to adapt to?
Well, I guess it wasn't a big jump on that second occasion because I had spent 4 years here as a young boy, and I became very familiar with the way of life. And there are differences. I think the thing that I remember most as a difference was the education I had up to that point, and then arriving in England and eventually sitting for my 11+ exams, which I don't think exist anymore.
That's right, yeah.
And it was a tough journey in that respect because I wasn't familiar with European history. I was really somewhat knowledgeable about American history and other courses that were slightly different to a lot of difference, actually. I had no French experience in being taught it, whereas it was one of the first classes I took when I first moved over. So those things impacted a lot more than making friends, which I made a lot of, and all the other things when you settle into a new home. But it was the education that really took a while for me to settle down in, and as a result, I didn't do well on the 11+.
Right.
And I wound up at a school called Haverstock.
Because the 11+, for those who don't know, if you passed it, you went to a grammar school, a good, a well-respected school. If not, you went to a lesser school. So that's what happened to you.
Yes, exactly. It was Haverstock Hill, which still is there, but it was a very in that period of time, it was still, in terms of its architecture and its whole development, very Victorian. I even remember if you wanted to go to the loo, you had to go out of whatever building you were in, and they were outside loos. Whereas several years ago, I went back and was asked to speak as somebody who had lived in London and actually went to Haverstock and tell my experiences and then what happened to me after I left. And it was unbelievable, the difference. It had been something like £20 million of investment had been put into Haverstock, and now when you pass it, it just looks like a very modern major school. And it was exciting to go back and to talk to, what I was asked to do is to talk to the mostly students who were specializing in music and the arts.
Right, and they had indoor plumbing as well as a bonus by that stage too. Yeah.
Well, for us in the days that I went there, everything was off campus, so to speak. I remember having to walk up Haverstock Hill to get to a gym or to a pool. It was a different environment completely.
Yeah. So you eventually, after the musical, then you earned your living as a composer in London.
Yes, well, actually, what happened, Graham, was that one of the investors in Two Cities that invested in the show invested because he liked the score, which by that time my dad and I had written. My father wrote the lyrics, by the way, and I composed all the music and orchestrated all the dance music. And so he liked it. That's one of the reasons he invested into it. And he was, in his day, during that period, a very successful director of TV and cinema commercials, and he asked me if I'd like to compose the music for a new campaign for, at the time, the largest advertising agency in the world, J. Walter Thompson, and it was for the Cheese Board. I remember this very vividly, and my fee was 200 guineas.
Right.
After that, it's all a bit hazy, but that is actually how I carried on in England and got more and more commissions as I made myself known and the musical ran, and there was no desire or reason for me to go back to California professionally. So really that's where it kicked off for me, and it's never changed.
Give us a little tip that we can use it maybe in a pub trivia quiz for some of the more famous jingles we might remember from the past that you wrote, that we can say, Jeff Wayne, War of the Worlds, wrote that one?
Gosh, I have to tell you, by the time I pretty much stopped doing music for advertising, it was totally because my career had gone off in different directions, not just the War of the Worlds, but some other things. But I had composed and produced, including some TV and radio themes, a few film scores, but over 3,000 productions.
Wow.
In a 10-year period. Yeah, it was quite extraordinary. So I think one that I could ask, and you tell me if you like the idea, is there's probably the most known song in the War of the Worlds is called Forever Autumn.
Yeah, Justin Hayward, yeah.
And that's right. And it started off life as a TV commercial.
Did it really? What for?
Well, it was for Lego toys.
Really?
Yeah, and I still actually have a copy of the actual commercial. But what you would hear is the two guys that actually wound up writing the lyrics for what became Forever Autumn. But they were also session singers and also sung in bands, and they were already very much involved in the music scene. And we met, and they started doing tons of vocals for me of all different styles for advertising and some film work. And if you were to hear the original Lego, there was no words, but what I asked them to do is I wrote this tune, which became the first verse of the song of Forever Autumn, and they just went. It was very Simon and Garfunkel-like as an arrangement that I did. And they were just going do 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 do, etc. So you got through one verse, but then the public, when the commercials started being aired, there was a large response from the general public saying, "Is this a record?" It was just very well liked.
Yeah.
And about that same point, Paul Rodgers and Gary Osborne, who were the two singers that I was mentioning, they wrote the lyrics for what became Forever Autumn as part of a debut album that I produced and wrote all the music for, did the arrangements, and the album came out on MCA Records in America and then internationally. And the beginning of the life of Forever Autumn began on their debut album, and it came out as a single in Japan and got to, it was either number 2 or number 3, and they toured there. And but you'd have to know that history to know how Forever Autumn really began, because by the time I was composing the score for the War of the Worlds, and Forever Autumn was sort of inserted into the score, it was the only piece that I didn't compose originally for the War of the Worlds.
Right. Everything else you did from scratch, yeah.
Yeah, and I had no desire to include Forever Autumn, but I kept coming to a point in the story where our leading character, the journalist, is getting from Horsell Common in Surrey, trying to sort of rescue his fiancée and her father, who are living in London, from the invading Martians. And he arrives at their house to discover that she's not there. And that became, because you're not here, it became the sort of hook line of the song. And I couldn't compose anything other than coming back to the War of the Worlds. I kept rejecting everything I wrote. Gary Osborne and Paul wrote, and Paul Rodgers wrote the lyrics as a full song, slightly amending the lyrics to their version. And I sort of raised the white flag to the Martians and said, okay, Forever Autumn's in.
It had to be in. And so how did you hook up with Justin Hayward then from Moody Blues?
Well, it was very similar to all the other guest artists. It was either knowing them, with David Essex and Julie Covington, I had already been working with them a lot in different ways. With Justin, Phil Lynott, Chris Thompson, I didn't know them. I knew of them, but I didn't know them, and I found a way to be introduced to them, and I wrote to Justin and sent him a little tape cassette that had what was both Forever Autumn and the demos for the main theme called The Eve of the War, which has a hook. The chances of anything coming from Mars are 1,000,000 to 1. And that was the two songs that his role, which was the voice, the sung thoughts of the journalist. So instead of Richard Burton bursting into song, it went over to a musical character who became the sung thoughts of the journalist. And Justin loved it. He particularly loved Forever Autumn. And he came to the studio to have a listen, because every tune that had singing on it, I didn't presume, even with David and Julie, who I could call up as mates by that point, and say, would you like to appear on this musical work I'm composing, and come in the sessions tomorrow or next week, and there's nothing to play him. So I demoed everything, and it convinced pretty much everybody who came in. There were a couple that came in that didn't think it was quite right for them.
Really? Big names?
Yeah, or a couple that tried something out, and Paul Rodgers, who was then in...
he'd been in Free, and he was in Bad Company at the time, I think.
And during that period, he actually came in to play the role of Parson Nathaniel, the part that Phil Lynott wound up playing. And spent a day with him, and his voice sounded amazing, as it was and still is. And then he was going to come back something like the next day or a day after to do all what was the acting sessions that were interactions with the journalist, Richard Burton, and the parson's wife, which was played by Julie Covington. And something jittered him. He felt very comfortable doing all the singing, but I guess as I learned from his manager, Peter Grant, that acting wasn't his thing, and the more he thought about walking into the studio and acting, particularly with Richard Burton, just sort of got to the point where he felt he couldn't come back in and complete the work. What he didn't quite get, or still didn't want to change his view about, was that Richard and Julie were already recorded.
Right.
And they didn't appear together in the same studio just because of availabilities. And Richard was, we recorded Richard, or most of all the material with him in California. So Paul Rodgers would have been coming back into the same studio he spent the day at doing the singing parts, and he wouldn't have been sitting opposite Richard and Julie doing an acting scene together.
Yeah. So he missed out big time, didn't he?
Well, some things are meant to happen, and I was very fortunate to then have been introduced to Phil. And the way I hoped that would interest him was that I had actually been a Thin Lizzy fan and knew a song that Phil started out talking. It was called Fool's Gold. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a lot of it. It was maybe 15 seconds, 20 seconds, something like that. But it was very dramatic. And in addition to his singing style, which was amazing, I thought, gosh, maybe he'd like to play the role of Parson Nathaniel, who's a man who actually goes totally bonkers. He thinks the Martians are the devil. Yeah. And he loses all hope and faith. And there, as a man of the cloth, you would think is the person you'd go to for spiritual and moral comfort in your local community. And he's the first one that completely loses it. And his wife, named Beth, which was the role that Julie played, they did a very long piece called The Spirit of Man, which is essentially a duet where they go back and forth, where he's lost it and has no faith, and his wife is trying to keep him from going completely mad, because she does believe that life has value and that there's always something worth living for. And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, everybody who was interested came in to have a listen. And in this instance, Phil came in and loved it immediately. And with his management, we struck a deal very, very quickly. And he started the sessions pretty soon thereafter. But unfortunately, he got a terrible case of flu. And if one was to hear the very original takes, you'd hear it in the voice. So we said, let's start again. The only problem was that he was going to, I think it was America and Canada, for about 3 months to do a tour. So we waited, because there was no question I wanted him to stay on board, and he wanted to do the same. So we waited, and it turned out brilliant.
Good stuff. Now, you mentioned Richard Burton. And in 1978, by 1978, Richard Burton had quite a reputation as a hellraiser. First of all, I don't think you could have picked a better voice or a better actor to do it. Obviously, until Liam Neeson many, many years later. But Richard Burton, how easy or difficult was he to work with?
Well, you're absolutely right, Graham, that he came with a reputation. Mm-hmm. He was such a famous person that everything that he got covered in the media, the press, and as a result, even though it was a very easy, when I say task, to enter into an agreement with him, the first thing was that he wanted to actually do it. I didn't pick him; he sort of picked me.
Really?
What I mean by that is, when I finished composing the first draft of my score, my stepmom, a lady named Doreen, who was from Hull originally, then raised with her family in Manchester, then came to London, and she was an author of books. She did some journalism, and she adapted the H.G. Wells novel based upon all sorts of notes and ideas that I was doing within the musical score. We finished about the same time, our first drafts, and by that point we had the names and the characters of all the leading roles that would appear on what became my musical version. And the role of the journalist is the only complete acting role. Yeah. No singing, all acting. When we only had a list, when I say a list, I'm not even sure you'd call it a list. There's maybe 2 or 3 other names beside Richard, but his was right at the very top because of the quality of his voice. It's like a musical instrument, in my opinion. And his acting skills, of course. And the opening piece particularly, I wanted the listener to hopefully be drawn into our world of the War of the Worlds, and to have a voice of the stature of Richard Burton was sort of the best piece of good fortune that started the casting, so to speak, of my double album.
Yeah.
But how do you get to somebody if you don't know them? And it's always the same process. You hope to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, or you find out who their agent or manager is, and eventually you get to a point where you find out of that person's interest. But where we really had this sort of rub of the green, so to speak, was that as this was going on, we had some friends who had just come back from New York on a holiday, and they came over for dinner just to catch up, and we're sitting around, and they said, oh, yeah, we had this great time in New York, and we saw a play called Equus. Brilliant, starring Richard Burton. And suddenly my radar goes up, and I'm thinking, gosh, if Richard Burton is appearing in New York in a play, he's probably doing, 8 shows a week. And I found out eventually what theater he was at through these friends. And again, no internet, no Google in those days. So I just, with a postage stamp and an envelope big enough to hold the first draft of the script and a letter that I wrote introducing myself and saying I'm a composer, producer, working on a musical interpretation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. The first draft of our script is enclosed, and I wonder if you'd like to consider playing the role of the journalist. And what I decided to do at that point was not to try to send it to a manager. If he had one, I knew by then the name of the theater, and I sent it to the stage door, hoping that on one of the show days that he would come in, the man at the stage door would hand him my little care package, which is exactly what happened. And, did I know that I'd even get a response? No, but it couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 days after my package arrived that I received a call from a man named Robert Lance, based in New York, who was Richard's manager of that time. And he called me at my home, and in fact I was in a meeting with my dad and Doreen about something to do with the War of the Worlds, and I picked up the phone, and it was Robert Lance on behalf of Richard Burton saying, Richard's received your package, he's read it all, and he loves the idea, and the following words, which I will never forget, were from him, were, count him in, dear boy. I handed the phone sort of in shock to my dad, and between him and Mr. Lance, they struck a deal over the phone.
Wow.
Which got turned into a contract, but it's held up to this day, and his last wife, Sally, inherited everything from him, so we still have contact. When we performed the War of the Worlds in Australia and New Zealand, she came to one of our shows in Australia. But as to the precise question of what was it like to work with somebody with such a reputation, well, all I can say is that wasn't the Richard Burton I worked with or got to know thereafter. He was the most charming and well-prepared performer I've ever worked with, and he was so enthusiastic about it. We even have outtakes of things that when he stumbled on something or did a take that we were, say, happy with, he'd say, no, look, I think I can do it again better. These are delicious words.
Yeah.
And comments like that. Yeah, and we've got them on our outtakes, and it's lovely to think back about a man that I started knowing through a reputation and turned out to be quite a different bloke.
So there wasn't the slightest sign of him being awkward, difficult, finding the bottle, anything like that at all?
Not at all. I can't explain it any other way because it's just not the Richard Burton I got to know. Maybe it was the time in his life where he decided to straighten himself out, and it didn't just, it wasn't that I noticed this just on the session, because contractually we had the right to work with Richard for 5 studio days of up to 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
We went to California to stay on our schedule. We had to go to California because by the time it was all agreed, he had left Equus in New York and gone to Los Angeles to make a movie.
Yeah.
So we agreed to go to L.A., the whole production team, and we recorded him. And, you know, when I was saying a minute or two ago how well prepared he was, to give you an idea, we had something like 150 sequences that the role of the journalist was to record, and he did it all in one not even long day.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, that just gives you an idea of the standard of his work, the way that he took the direction, and in such a nice way. We did have to, because the first assembly of the War of the Worlds was about 2 hours in length, and particularly in the era of the black vinyl disc, where even 4 sides, you know, there was a maximum amount of time that you could fit sound on before it all started to lose the bass end and just didn't sound very good. So I did an editing of that first assembly, and it came down from 2 minutes to something like 95, 100 minutes, which is what eventually came out. And Richard, as a result, had to come back and do some repair work that wasn't really anything to do with the standard of what he did. It was simply because I made cuts to sort of all the elements, not just the script, but some of the music material, to get it down. And he came back now in London, excuse me, for it was something like 2 to 3 hours, and that was him done. But after the War of the Worlds came out, we actually stayed in touch, and he asked me to compose the score for a TV special that he had signed to do for one of the American networks. And it was to be, from his point of view, reading selected works of Dylan Thomas, who he was a good friend with.
Yeah.
And then visually there were going to be interpretations as he was performing whatever the piece was. And he asked me to compose the score. And jump forward to 1984, because the album came out in 1978. So that gives you a span of time that we did stay in touch on and off. We met in London, spent the day together to talk about this TV production, and he had agreed also to become a talking head on what would have been my first tour of the War of the Worlds, more concert-like rather than multimedia as it has become.
Yeah. So and up until that stage, it had never been toured live?
No, never.
Right.
I had guest conducted a couple of pieces from the War of the Worlds with orchestras and other lineups, but no. And I had been asked fairly, you know, when I say regularly, on and off over a period of those years, to take a tour on the road. But and again, limitations of technology in those days. It was more concert, but with this talking head.
Yeah.
And Richard agreed immediately. So we met in 1984. He just finished a movie called 1984. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, he said, right, well, me and Sally, his last wife, we're going on holiday to Switzerland. He said, we're coming back in a fortnight, and we can get together again to firm up when we're going to do the talking head, because I had taken him on that day to the studios in London that had the technology, how to make talking heads. Mm-hmm. And we'll firm up, actually, the recording session dates for the TV special. Great. I couldn't, be more thrilled to be working with him again.
Yeah. Not
just on the War of the Worlds now, but a second project. And a week later, he died in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And my wife and I, we wound up at his memorial service in called St. Martin's in the Field in London, just by Trafalgar Square, and it was quite surreal, to be honest. And all his family and other wives, and just the whole thing was extraordinary. But and in a way, that was in 1980. That was the summer of 1984, around August. I then stopped the idea of taking this tour, and without Richard's performance, and I went on to another project and just wanted to get my head clear of Martians and come back to it on another day.
Well, for the 40th anniversary, I know that the double album as a vinyl album has been re-released, and it's done quite well, because vinyl, there's a real resurgence of the format. This new tour, tell me a little bit about this, these arena shows. What's this going to be like, and who's in it?
Right. Well, we started arena touring in 2006, mm-hmm. and it included a talking head of Richard Burton, which we didn't have the benefit of Richard because of the years past when he passed away. But we had film, and particularly 2 still images of him that were perfect for the age that the journalist was meant to be. And with technology that was now available, we could recreate him with what became something like a 25-foot tall, 9-10 feet wide talking head. And he hovered above the stage while the rest of the production, all live, went on in front of the audiences. And in 2006, it was already quite a mega multimedia production. But each tour we've done, and we've done a lot now, it keeps growing. Just in stuff, to give you an idea, Graham, we were a 6-truck tour in 2006, and this coming year we're up to 12.
Doubled it.
Yeah, bloody expensive.
I bet. Yeah.
In fact, truthfully, in today's world, you're only limited by your imagination and your pocketbook.
Right.
And every tour we have grown it, and this tour is no different. We have a couple of amazing new ingredients that will bring the production more into the audience while it's still going on the stage, above the stage.
Can you say what these ingredients are?
Sure. Well, first of all, we brought 4 giant screens into the audience on different angles. We've always had one big screen that goes in the back, about 100 feet wide and 25 feet tall. But these are 4 now that are in the audience for creative reasons, to be able to see and do things in the editing that we could never do previously. It also, and I've always been aware of it, when I've gone to concerts or shows, in particularly, the big arenas, where the further back you sit, the less involved you feel you are.
Yeah.
And I've wanted to, on this production particularly, give more personal contact with the show, the artists that are in them. So that's one of the new ingredients. But we also have a physical new ingredient that is an extension of, it's a piece that the artilleryman, who performs well into the second second act, and he's got a sort of he's not super intelligent, but he's got this vision of how man can survive while the Martians are now dominating the Earth, and that's to take the best of those who have survived underground and to rebuild a brave new world, which is the name of the piece. Up till this tour, a large part of it is performed on a bridge in the shape of sort of like an arc. And it's impressive, and it has always been impressive, no matter how much we've dressed it up and extended it over the years. It's on stage, whereas this production, it's grown in size, and it comes down, connects with the stage, but is even a bigger arc, and it's over the audience, sort of central to the stage. And he performs Brave New World not only on top of this bridge, but also there's a performance area further along into the audience. And to give you an idea of the scale of it, if you were to take 2 of the biggest arenas in Great Britain that we play, Manchester and the O2, this bridge from the stage extends about 50% over the entire audience.
Wow, that's quite a span.
Yeah, the scale is something. But as we go into the smaller arenas, and small isn't small in that world, the smallest arenas are 4,000 or 5,000 seaters, and everything in between that and the 2 biggest. And so by the time you get to the smaller arenas, this bridge is virtually the length of the whole downstairs section. It pretty much touches our front of house desk and where all the sound is mixed from. So it's bringing the show to the audience. It's exciting, and no matter where you sit, you'll see it from a different way than if you were sitting and looking at this bridge come down on the stage. So physically, those are 2 of the biggest new ingredients, but there's a whole bunch more. There's some new musical contents. So it's advanced yet again.
And the performers in it this time on this tour?
Right. Well, Liam is still returning. He travels with us in a little hard disk
Yeah.
He's never late. He never misses a cue. And the rest of the cast are mostly new to the War of the Worlds, with the exception of Jason Donovan, who comes back as Parson Nathaniel. This is his fourth tour with us. He started as an artilleryman and then found God and became Parson Nathaniel.
Okay. Right.
And he's great fun to work with. He's such a talented man, and I always look forward to working with Jason. Returning with Jason for her second time is a singer-actress, Carrie Hope Fletcher, who's become very popular, starting with playing Eponine in the West End production of Les Mis. She's done other productions. She's written a couple of books, and a most glorious voice and a lovely lady with that. So those are our two returning members. We now have, as the sung thoughts of the journalist, having had Justin Hayward for a number of our tours, and then Marty Pellow, and now it's Newton Faulkner, who has quite an amazing voice, and the look about him is perfect. And everybody, by the way, has come in already and tried out everything they have to do, so they're comfortable with the material, and we too feel the same, and then we go forward with a contract, so to speak. So Newton, he plays the sung thoughts of the journalist. Then we have Nathan James, who has one of the biggest rock voices I've ever heard. He's the lead singer for a group called Inglorious, and he's the voice of humanity, the person who's witnessing the final battle between man and Martian at the end of the first half of the show. And the song is called Thunderchild, and it's about this final battle where, after it, man has been defeated. So it's Martians 1, humanity 0 after the first half, and then the story unfolds after that. And all the guest artists now, they appear in multiple pieces, which is not how it started all those years ago. And then as the artilleryman, we have Adam Garcia, who he's been in many different things. He's a singer, an actor, a great dancer. He's been in a movie called Coyote Ugly. He had the leading role in that. He opened the Olympic Games in Australia with Kylie Minogue, and they performed. He's just played a dramatic role in the West End called The Exorcist. He was a judge, because he's a brilliant dancer, on the TV series, which I think has now ended, called You Can Dance. So when you look at Adam's career, it's really a sort of a patchwork quilt of many top things. So he's our artilleryman. And then I'm up on stage conducting again the Ula de Bula Strings and the Black Smoke Band. And it's mostly musicians that have started with me as far back as 2006, and even two of the band members, Herbie Flowers and Chris Spedding, were on my original double album.
Chris Spedding, the guitar player, very famous session player. Yeah, had a hit with motorbiking, but Spedding's so well respected as a guitar player.
Oh yeah, and Herbie, if you look at their CVs of who they've played live with or recorded with, it's quite something. There's very few musicians who I think would have the length and breadth and quality of CVs that they have, and they're just as enthusiastic today performing it live. They've never missed an arena production with me. We actually did a season, something like 88 shows in the West End in 2016 at the Dominion Theatre, and Chris was even in that. So we go back a long way.
Yeah, and Anna Marie Wayne?
Anna Marie is my daughter.
Yes, that's why I mentioned
it. She has been an actress since around the age of 13, starting mostly in TV. Then she moved with what then was her husband to California. She's for about 6 years and did quite a bit of work there. And when we started in 2006, she became the fiance of the journalist. But it was literally 2 lines that were filmed. We felt it a bit, couldn't quite afford her to travel around to say 2 lines.
Yeah.
But the role, out of the way that the production has grown, has now become one of the largest roles, sort of equal to anybody else, and providing she can work her way through having 3 children, and how will she, tour with us live?
Yeah.
She's going to do it live, and if not, we have a B plan, which is a filmed role, but with these new screens and the 3D elements, it's not far off as if she was going to be there. So one way or another, she's involved again.
It just sounds like a terrific show. How, over the years, over the 40 years, how has your relationship with the work changed?
It's endured me completely, Graham, because what I fell in love with all those years ago was a very dark Victorian tale, and its sort of 3 key themes are invasion, faith, and hope. And nothing has changed. The world is no different. We look at the world we live in, but I'd like to think that one walks away from either listening or seeing the show feeling more hopeful than fearing the world. And nothing has changed. What I've definitely seen is that once I started touring, I could get a much better impression from how audiences from a live production were responding, and it gave me the motivation to go back and listen to those 150 takes or so of Richard's original recording, because of the length of the production, the length of the double album, particularly the double album. What the audiences heard and saw in the first 6 or so productions, arena tours, was about 74 of those 150 sequences that Richard recorded. So the reason that Liam Neeson and the show became known as The New Generation was because I went back to that script with Richard and said, there's a lot of rich material, no pun intended there, that never has been heard. And it's got good value, so we set about sort of gluing it all back together, but writing some new stuff as well. And The New Generation now, with Liam, instead of 74 sequences, Liam alone has 91 sequences, which gives you an idea, when you add up all the other new material of The New Generation, how it's grown. And it's worked tremendously well. It's given me, as a musician, a chance to re-examine material that also either could be extended, or there was, in fact, one minor theme that appeared right through that point, starting with the recordings, that had a lot of emotion attached to it within the story, and I've turned it into a song called Life Begins Again, and it's sung by all the guest artists. They do leads, counterlines, harmonies all together, and it appears in 2 places in the show, so that's an extension from what was a secondary theme. So there's been a lot of exciting material.
That's really good to know that you're not just showcasing 40-year-old work and sticking it on. The thing is evolving and improving all the time. It's a living thing.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. That's how I've always felt about it. From the value of the price of a ticket, I've never wanted anybody to think, I'm just taking it out of the box and doing it the same way again. It'd be a lot easier and a lot more profitable.
Yeah.
But that's never been my dream about it. And yes, I refer to it as you've just done, as a living work in every respect.
Jeff Wayne, the musical version of the War of the Worlds 40th anniversary tour is something not to be missed. It's an honor to talk to you, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time.
Many thanks, Graham. Lovely to speak with you.